Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Shekalim. We are up to Perek Daled Mishnah Het. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'elu Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Aranbai, and Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov, Menuchatam Began Eden, Amen. The Mishnah continues its discussion of different items that have been consecrated without a specified purpose and presents another opinion on what should be done with them. The Mishnah begins, Hamakdish Nechasim, if someone consecrated his belongings without specifying their purpose, Vayu ben Dvarim Reuyin al Gabe HaMizbeach, and among these belongings there were items fit to be offered on the altar, Yenot, Shmanim, Ve'ofot, such as wines and oils that are fit for Nisachim and Mincha offerings, and birds that are fit for bird offerings. Now the Rav explains, turtle doves and pigeons are fit for bird chatat offerings and bird olah offerings. Also included in the law of the Mishnah is fine flour fit for mincha and nisachim offerings. Rabbi Elazar says, now this is the Tana Rabbi Elazar and should not be confused with the Tana Rabbi Eliezer quoted in the previous Mishnah, rules differently. So Rabbi Elazar says, they should be sold to those who need these types of supplies for their offerings, and in this way they will be offered on the altar. Since these supplies have been consecrated and they are fit for the altar, they must be offered on the altar. And with the money receives for them, the owner should buy animals and bring olah offerings. Now Rabbi Elazar's view is that anything fit for the altar that is consecrated without a specified purpose is not only considered consecrated for the altar, it must also be used specifically for animal olah offerings. Since the items listed in the Mishnah are not animals, they are sold and the money is used to bring animal olah offerings. Now the Pasuk in Sefer Vayikra chapter 22, Pasuk 18 says, all their vow offerings and all their donation offerings, which they will offer to Hashem for an olah, which Rabbi Elazar interprets this pasuk as teaching that anything fit for the altar that is consecrated without a specified purpose is to be used for an olah. The very next pasuk says, among the cattle, the flocks, and the goats. From here, Rabbi Elazar learns that they must be used specifically for animal olot. Therefore, even birds, which may themselves be brought as olah offerings, have to be sold and exchanged for animal olah offerings. Ushar nechasim yiplu lebedek habayit. The rest of the belongings that are not fit for the altar and have been sanctified go to the temple upkeep fund. Rabbi Elazar argues with both of the views presented in the previous Mishnah. Unlike Rabbi Eliezer, he rules that items fit for the altar are considered consecrated for the altar. In this he agrees with Rabbi Yeshua. However, he goes further than Rabbi Yeshua by requiring that these items must be used specifically for animal olah offerings. Now, according to the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua, though, they need only be used as olot, but not necessarily animal olot. Therefore, if there were birds among his belongings, they may be offered as bird olot according to Rabbi Yeshua, but not according to Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Yeshua required exchanging female animals for males that can be offered as olot, only because he understands the owner to have wanted his animals and birds to be used entirely by the altar, and only an olah is burned completely on the altar. Since a bird olah is also completely burned on the altar, birds can be offered directly as bird olot. Rabbi Elazar, on the other hand, rules that the consecrated supplies must be used for an animal olah offerings, because that is the rule dictated by the pasuk, like we explained. Therefore, even birds must be sold to buy animal olah offerings. And that is in Rabotai of Mishnah Ched. Mishnah Ted now begins. The temple would buy wine, oil, and fine flour that was produced and maintained at the high standards of purity required for offerings. When these supplies were bought for communal offerings, they were paid for from treasury chamber funds. Supplies for the communal nitzachim were bought from terumah funds. Sometimes the temple administrators entered into short-term agreements with suppliers and set prices for these supplies. Other times they would make long-term agreements with suppliers who committed to supplying the temple throughout the year. The Mishnah discusses the terms of this arrangement. First, the Mishnah describes these short-term agreements. Once every 30 days, the temple administrators set the prices for buying wine, oil, and fine flour with treasury chamber funds for the next 30 days. Once this price was agreed upon, the temple would buy the supplies they needed each day at the agreed upon price, even if the market price of the supplies went up. If, however, the market price of the supplies went down, the temple would pay only the new lower price. Now, the suppliers are bound to keep their agreement and supply the temple at the lower agreed upon price. The temple, however, will gain from a price drop. The temple is never forced to pay more than the market price, despite any prior agreement. Now the Mishnah discusses the law regarding the long-term agreements. If a seller accepted upon himself an agreement at the time of the harvest, now the temple administrators would sometimes enter into a long-term agreement at harvest time when the wheat, grapes, and olives are less expensive. By doing so, they lock in the low prices of the harvest season for the entire year. So if a seller accepted upon himself an agreement at the time of the harvest to supply the temple with fine flour at the rate of 4 se'ah of flour for 1 selah, or wine or oil at their respective rates, amdu mishalosh yisapek me'arba, and the price of flour went up, and it now stands at 3 se'ah for a selah, he must still supply the temple with flour at the agreed upon rate of 4 se'ah for a selah. Now, when entering into a long-term agreement, the temple would pay the supplier up front at harvest time for the year's supplies. Since the temple has already paid for the year's wheat, the supplier is bound to deliver the flour to the temple at the low price agreed upon at harvest time when he received his money. We learn from a pasuk that the temple acquires items it purchases once it pays for them, even before its representatives take physical possession of the goods. This is in contrast to private individuals who must do a kinyan. They must physically take the goods in order to acquire them. If, however, the price of flour was at 3 se'ah to a selah and it went down and now stands at 4 se'ah to a selah, he must supply the temple with flour at the new lower rate of 4 se'ah to the selah. Now, where the market price drops after the agreement has been made, the temple is not bound by the agreement to the higher price. This is because of a special rule that the temple is not to be treated worse than a private individual. Since a private individual is able to back out of an agreement as long as he has not taken physical possessions of the goods, the temple must be given the same right. At the same time, the rabbis also decreed that the seller in this case cannot back out of the agreement to supply the temple. Therefore, the seller is required to supply them at the new lower price. Shiyad Ekdesh ala Eluna, because the temple always has the upper hand in contracts. This means that the temple can always choose which of their rights they wish to exercise to enforce their contracts. Like we explained, a temple can insist on enforcing a long-term contract because they paid for the goods up front. At the same time, they can also insist on being treated no worse than a private individual who can back out of an unfavorable deal as long as he has not taken physical possession of what he has bought. Since the temple has the upper hand in contracts, the administrators can exercise whichever of these rights is to the temple's advantage in any situation. The Mishnah discusses another way the temple has the upper hand when dealing with suppliers. V'im hitli'as solet hitli'ah lo. Similarly, if the fine flour sold to the temple becomes wormy and no longer usable for offerings, the loss caused by the worminess is taken by the seller. Likewise, if wine sold to the temple turns sour and is no longer usable for nisachim, the loss caused by the souring is taken by the seller. Even if the temple has already taken possession of these supplies and paid for them, the seller must replace them. This is because the seller does not receive full possession of the money paid to him by the temple until the supplies he delivered to the temple are brought on the altar, and the altar brings about the acceptance of the offerings. While the seller is free to use the money paid to him as soon as he receives it, the sale is not considered complete, and the seller still bears responsibility for delivery of the goods until the supplies are accepted on the altar as an offering. Therefore, should the supplies become unusable before this point, the seller must replace them. This is a law of stringency. This law is a stringency enacted by the rabbis to protect the temple from loss. That is Rabotai, today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.